everyone. I'm Dr. Erica Boone, Director of the NIH Division of Biomedical Research Workforce. Welcome back to Focus on Fellowships, a video series structured to provide potential applicants and their supporters with essential information relevant to NIH's fellowship programs. Today is our fourth and final installment of Focus on Fellowships, and we're going to be discussing fellowship sponsors. In our first video, that is Focus on Fellowships video, we discussed the goals and the purpose of NIH fellowships and how to apply. In our second episode of Focus on Fellowships, we explored the application process from the perspective of the candidate. In our third episode, we discussed fellowships and peer review. Now, in our fourth and final episode, we're going to share some tips and advice for fellowship sponsors. And with that, I am joined again by Dr. Allison Gammy, Senior Advisor at the National Institute of General Medical Sciences. Welcome back, Allison.
Hey, Erica. Thanks for having me on again. I'm really looking forward to discussing the ways fellowship sponsors can support their research trainees during the application process.
It's always good to see you and to talk with you, and there's so much for us to discuss today, so we're going to jump right in. I'm sure that individuals that are acting as sponsors for the first time for fellowship candidates, or for those who are unfamiliar with the new fellowship application format, have lots of questions about how they can best support their candidates through the process and what they might need to provide to enhance the candidate submission.
Yeah, I agree completely. We often hear questions from sponsors about what their role is in preparing the fellowship application. And just to get a little vocabulary out there, when we say candidate, we mean the student or individual who will undertake the proposed fellowship training, whereas the candidate's research mentor we typically refer to as the sponsor. So let's start with instructions on where to find the various materials. The application instructions for every NIH grant program can be found on the NIH Grants and Funding site, in particular the application guide. And for these applications specifically, there are ones for fellowships, also known as Fs. The detailed fellowship application instructions are found in something called the SF424 application package. And individuals should be sure that you're using the correct forms or versions before you start moving ahead. For example, for the August 2025 deadline, you should be using what's known as Forms I. The Fellowship Notice of Funding Opportunities, also known as NOFOs, also specify which forms apply to that particular NOFO. So you can find that information there as well. Current instructions for all application types, whether it's a research grant, a career development award, or a fellowship, can always be found on the How to Apply page on the NIH Grants and Funding website.
Thank you so much for that rundown, Allison. As we know, this full instruction set can be long and a bit laborious, but it's really important that candidates and their sponsors really understand how to follow the instructions. They can interpret the instructions, how to follow those instructions in order to help the candidate have a successful application process or submission process. So what are some of the tips that you can share with our candidates and our sponsors who might not necessarily be so familiar?
Yes, so one of the things that the candidates need to pay particular attention to is the component called the PHS Fellowship Supplemental Form. And that will take you right to the subsections that are needed to be filled out by the candidate and the ones that are needed to be filled out by the sponsor. In each section, as you read through, you'll see who's responsible, the primary person responsible for that particular attachment. You can also find information on the format, the page limits, and what is expected in the content of each attachment.
Okay, so you talked about the forms, and you've talked about attachments. We want to dig a little bit more into those attachments, as well as the different sections in which the attachments go within the application. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the fellowship supplemental form I mentioned is made up of 8 sections, and some of those actually have subsections. The candidate section and research training plan should be developed primarily by the candidate. There are sections, however, that are for the sponsor to be filled out, and those include the commitment to the candidate, mentoring, and the training environment.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Allison. So let's take a moment to discuss what sponsors would need to know about these different sections: commitment to candidate, mentoring, and training environment sections.
So the sponsor section consists of 5 required areas and 1 optional one for candidates proposing clinical trial training as part of their fellowship. The first section asks the sponsor to describe their approach to mentoring and the specific mentorship that is planned for this particular candidate. They should discuss how the training and mentorship plan will support the candidate's career advancements and goals, and how they plan to advance through the biomedical research workforce. In the second section, the sponsor should provide a statement discussing their past mentorship experience. So the reviewers of these applications will be looking for an explanation of the sponsor's commitment to effective mentoring, and simply providing a list of past trainees with outcomes is insufficient to provide proof of good mentorship.
So what about sponsors that are in the earlier stages of their career and haven't had as much time to serve in official mentoring capacities as maybe their more established peers?
It's a really important point, and we definitely want to encourage early career sponsors to support their students to apply for these fellowships. So sponsors that are early in their career can include in this section any informal training and mentoring experiences that may have come from their student years or postdoctoral training periods. In addition, an early career sponsor can propose to incorporate any scientifically supported approaches to being an effective mentor. So just the fact that they read the scientific literature and know what makes for good mentoring is also going to be viewed positively.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So sponsors should also provide a detailed description of their commitment to the candidate's research training plan. For example, they can discuss the proposed frequency and nature of their meetings with the candidates throughout the training period.
So it seems like what we're really talking about here is the sponsor's readiness to mentor the fellowship candidate.
That's right, and we really want to make sure that there's evidence that the candidate will receive consistent, individualized attention that will help them succeed with their research training plan and with their future career goals.
I really like what you said there. It's really about the candidate receiving consistent, individualized attention and mentorship that's going to really be important to their success, and detailing that within the application of the sponsor, detailing that is really going to be important. So it's really about high quality mentorship, not necessarily a pedigree. That's really important, and that will be key to the candidate's success. Okay, so now that we know that, so what can we talk a little bit more about the sponsor's description of the research training environment?
Yes, the sponsors are asked to describe the research training environment, and in particular how it will meet the needs of the candidates to achieve the goals that are outlined in the fellowship application. As part of this, the sponsor may address day-to-day research training environment, any organizational resources. That includes relevant training programs that are provided by the organization. Other activities may include professional development opportunities, seminars, conferences, courses, and anything really that will specifically be important for this individual's research training experience. Additionally, sponsors are required to discuss the candidate's potential.
Okay, time out. What do we mean by potential?
So the sponsor should discuss the candidate's skills, abilities, aptitudes that will contribute to their future success, as well as any major areas for development. The sponsor should provide an overall assessment of the candidate's preparedness for the research training plan and for the likelihood of success.
And the examples and assessments should align with the information that's shared in the candidate section and the research training plan section as well. So all parts of the application should be in alignment, whether it was completed by the candidate or completed by the sponsor.
Absolutely. So everything should, in the section that the sponsor write, is really about affirming that the candidate is ready for the proposed training and that the sponsor is fully committed to supporting this research training experience and any future plans that the candidate has.
That's a very good point. And I also want to reiterate one more time that candidates should be working in tandem with their sponsors towards the completion or development and completion of the fellowship application. The candidate should not feel the need to just work on this application as an island without any consultation from their mentor or their sponsor. As a matter of fact, that will probably spell as a recipe for disaster if you're not coordinating with your sponsor while you're developing the application and completing the application. Now that you have talked about the 5 major parts, I said this was 10, so I meant 5 major parts of the application. You also mentioned a 6th optional section. Can you discuss what would be required in this 6th section?
Yes, so Erica, this is when a candidate is proposing to gain experience in a clinical trial. And the sponsor obviously is the one leading and overseeing the trial, but they must describe the level of oversight that they're going to provide to the candidate and provide details on the trial itself, such as the source of funding for the trial or any role that the fellow will be playing in this clinical trial.
Okay, so taking a step back, if this 6th section is required, again, it's going to be really important for the candidate to work with their sponsor to complete this section. It's all for the betterment of the completion of a more cohesive application from the candidate.
Yes, absolutely. It's always key that the candidate and sponsor are working together. And when one is preparing a section, they should be in consultation to make sure that they're aligned. This includes the mentoring plan and the candidate's goals, but if they're involved in a clinical trial, it's also important for that component as well.
Absolutely. So staying with the sponsors, besides the sponsor's statements, how else should the sponsor be contributing to the development and completion of this application?
Although the candidate should be the one conceiving and preparing the research training plan sections, the sponsor is encouraged to provide guidance. Mm-hmm. For example, they should be helping to develop the research training activities and timeline section to ensure that the planned activities are feasible and also relevant to the candidate's goals. They're also encouraged to be involved in the review and revisions of what's known as the research training project section. So that's the part that describes the scientific project that the fellow will be working on.
Okay, so it's all about the big G for the sponsor, and that G is for guidance. And they can guide them through the completion of all of these different sections, of which the sponsors should be familiar with, especially if they've already previously prepared an application for NIH funding.
That's right. But just in case the sponsors don't have NIH application experience, which is actually fine, there are detailed instructions of how to fill out each section, including the research training project section. And these are found, once again, in the SF424 instructions, as well as any additional instructions in the NOFO itself. There are also additional web pages that help out with this. And again, if neither the sponsor or the candidate has experience with the NIH application process, they are always encouraged to talk to their Office of Sponsored Research just to see if they can get some help there as well.
Thank you so much for that. And also sometimes when you have some questions, you should be encouraged to reach out to your potential program officers as well, because they can help you when you're coming up against any barriers towards application development or submission. You have any questions. So now let's switch tracks just a little bit and talk about this thing called Training in Responsible Conduct for Research, or RCR. So NIH requires that all trainees, fellows, and scholars that are receiving any type of support from NIH through NIH research training grants, career development awards, whether they're individual or institutional, research education grants, or dissertation research grants, must receive instruction in RCR, or responsible conduct of research. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the training in RCR is really something all degree granting organizations should be providing to students or trainees conducting biomedical research. Candidates can therefore often derive the content for this section from resources that will be provided by their organizations. But with the understanding that they should know what they're putting in their application and that they really plan to incorporate this RCR training into their overall training plan. And once again, the specific details for what is required of an RCR curriculum can be found in the instructions.
These instructions are so very important to read and to understand. So thank you so much for that, Allison. Now, in part one of Focus on Fellowships, you and I discussed how NIH has made some changes to fellowship applications, or the process of applying for fellowships in the last year. So going back to the parts of the application, has anything changed with the sponsors' contributions, in particular for their biosketches?
So the sponsors should be happy to hear that there have been no changes to the biosketches for Forms I. And any changes that were important to the candidate we discussed in part 2 of this series.
So I know that the sponsors find this to be a relief that at least something has not changed for them in this application process. But before we let you go, Allison, are there any final tips or bits of advice that you'd like to leave our sponsors with?
Just a couple more things. So first and foremost, just want to remind the sponsors that the fellowship is intended to be about the candidate's research training experience. And so the purpose of the fellowship is to provide the candidates with the resources, environment, and time to develop into a more independent scientist, and to prepare them for the next stage of their career. So obviously, just to say again, the sponsor should be involved in the application process, but it is ultimately up to the candidate to take responsibility for the content of the fellowship application.
I can really appreciate what you've just said. This fellowship experience is about the candidate and their next stages of their career and preparation for that. So it's not necessarily about the sponsors, it's about the candidate.
That's right. Yes, absolutely. And just one more reminder, just to emphasize that NIH's policies evolve and change. The candidates may need some help navigating these changes in policies and what those might mean for them and their research training. So the sponsors, we encourage them to help the candidates navigate any changes in policies, any notices that are associated with the notice of funding opportunity that may specifically impact the application.
This is all such great advice, Allison. I want to thank you for once again joining me today for Focus on Fellowships, in particular, our final installment of Focus on Fellowships.
It's always a pleasure, Erica, and thanks so much for having me on.
And thanks to you all out there for joining us today. We hope that you found this episode of Focus on Fellowships to be really helpful with regards to your understanding of the application and review process, what's required for the completion of the application, whether it's for the candidate or whether it is for the sponsor as well. For more information on NIH fellowships and NIH's other grant programs, you can follow us on LinkedIn, on X, and YouTube, and you can also listen to the All About Grants podcast. You can also visit grants.gov to explore NIH's funding opportunities and visit the NIH Grants and Funding site for more information on NIH's various training and career development programs. Thank you all once again for joining us. Take care and good luck on your submissions. Until next time.